And I'm here with Matt Waldman, the creator of the Rookie Scouting Portfolio and Football Guys staff writer. And how are you today? We're going to talk a little bit about running backs and so on.
Sounds great, Toki. Sounds great.
And in your process of evaluating offensive talent, which is mostly what you do, what is how long does it take for you to evaluate a player, and what is your process in doing it?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the work that I do is based on best practices that I learned in a different industry for evaluating performance. And so, what I try to implement is a process that allows me to continue to add to that process and help that process grow. So, there's some flexibility to it. There's kind of a built in feedback mechanism so that I can learn to figure out ways to do the best I can to objectify subjective material. Um, and and a lot of that is just so a lot of that process entails watching the players play, having some very defined criteria for what I'm going to be looking at when I grade a player, and then having certain weights for those particular players, for those particular skill sets. And and so really what ends up happening is I'll watch anywhere between 3 to 5 games on tape, um, where I will go through the actual process of documenting everything that I see play by play, and giving my observations in addition to what I see play by play, and score those on a checklist with all of that criteria. And I'll come up with 2 grades with that. One will be a checklist of criteria that is based on the breadth of their talent, really how much of what they do fulfills the requirements of the position in the broadest sense. So if you were looking at interviewing someone for a job, you might be looking for certain skills or capabilities that they may have. And you would be looking to see maybe there's 10 things that you put on your list of what you're looking for from someone to perform tasks in that job. And the first checklist I look at would look at breadth of talent. So how many of those tasks can they fill in a basic manner of fitting how I define those tasks? And then the other way that I look at it is depth of talent. So for me, then it's how good are those players at the tasks that they can perform? And built into that is how likely is it from my view and my experience, that these players are likely to improve in those areas, if they have areas where they can improve. So I grade depth of talent and breadth of talent, and it gives, I base my rankings more on depth of talent than breadth of talent, but it gives you an idea, the reader an idea to see where certain players might have a wider range of fits with teams, because what's very important is really the fit with their organization, with the offense that they're playing in. You can have a player who may not be as talented as, player A may be not as talented as player B, but he may have a wider range of skills that apply to what the team needs from him, and he would be a better performer for that team than player
Right.
B. So,
Yeah.
so that's, a good example of a player maybe the opposite of that would be someone like, um, Mike Wallace. You could say Mike Wallace, the wide receiver who used to be with the Pittsburgh Steelers and now with the Vikings, and Emmanuel Sanders, the wide receiver for the Denver Broncos, who used to be with the Steelers when they were on the team together. You could probably argue that Mike Wallace had a higher depth of talent, um, in certain areas as a deep threat that made him a better fit for what the Steelers were doing with their passing game early on, but that Emmanuel Sanders had a wider breadth of talent and still had a great enough depth of talent that once he began to make the transition to the league and he was able to get healthy, and once he got healthy and ended up on another team because he had some injuries, his talent shined. So those are things I look at when I study, and so it comes down to really watching a lot of game film.
Yeah, and what I the feeling I sit here with is that must take a buttload amount of time. I mean,
It
yeah,
does.
I bought your RSP in 2014, and that was the first time I bought it, and I thought I bought it like a month before the draft, and I just thought, okay, I'll try and get some of this down. And it was 1,284 pages of PDF document. But
Yeah.
how much time goes into this, and how much time goes into each individual player?
Sure. And it sounds like the product of an insane human being when you first look at it and describe it in that fashion. And certainly that seems understandable. But the one thing that I'd like to point out to anybody listening is that while the document tends to be rather large, I mean, extremely large in that sense, it's really split up into two parts. The first part is really what the majority of people read, and it's no more than about 250 pages in length. So it's the size of a larger magazine style publication, and that's where all the work is presented in a more consumable fashion for a reader. Everything's kind of categorized. You get split into chapters. There are certain segments or sections that are in with each chapter, that kind of give you an overview of who the players are, how good they can be, and summaries of all the work that I've done. But what I end up doing is that I add on all of the work that I've done to arrive at those points. And the reason I did that is when I first got it started, I wasn't an NFL scout. I wasn't a former player or former coach. So I felt from a marketing standpoint, especially from a grassroots marketing standpoint, it made more sense for me to be very transparent with my process, because that was what I was really selling. And that if the results were there, that people would see not only that the results were good, but they'd also see that I spent a great deal of time doing this and that I show all my work. And that gave it more legitimacy to a potential consumer looking at the product. So there are some people who actually look at all my play-by-play notes, which make up somewhere between 800 to 1,000 pages of information. And I'm due this year long. I will watch players and I just write down, I write down what I see and I put it in a database format. And you'll find that some of that material has some redundancies where I'm copying and pasting similar entries into different categories of what I'm observing where they apply. So, from that standpoint, the length is probably a little bit more inflated than really needs to be in there. But it's just a way of showing people my process.
Yeah.
And so it does take year long, and I'll watch players, oftentimes it'll take me, for one position, it might take me, an hour or two to watch one position. For another position, it might take me 3 to 4. And then for a position like quarterback, it might take me, 8 hours to watch one player and really study what they do.
Yeah. But in that process, how important are measurements of the prospect? And now the combine has just started, and how much does that alter your evaluation of a player? For example, Derrick Henry just made a 37 vertical jump here today. For example, how could that change your evaluation of a player?
It would change my evaluation only if, and really I would say it wouldn't change my evaluation. It might cause me to go back and look at more game tape. So for instance, if I watched, say, I'll give you a hypothetical because Derrick Henry is a good example of a player where And I will probably give you a different example than Derrick Henry because I think it would apply more. But to start with Derrick Henry, I mean, I watched him again last night. It was probably the fourth or fifth time that I'd studied him, and the third time that I had studied him formally for the publication where I wrote everything down. And you can see on tape that he actually he actually shows that athletic ability to start, stop very fast, to make lateral cuts in a way that some people characterize as not as good as you would think, but it's actually better than they think. And you can see some of that explosive ability. It's just that when you see it on a guy who's 247 pounds, it can be somewhat deceptive. And he's also not going to be a sharp cutting, high agility athlete at the same level as someone like LaShawn McCoy or Jamal Charles, who weigh, 30 pounds or 30 pounds lighter. But he has some of those skills that are deceptively good in the same way that a guy like Le'Veon Bell did. I mean, he's a good example of a player that I watched who I felt like had the quickness to play in the NFL at a high level, even though at the time he weighed 230 pounds when he entered the Steelers camp. And there are a lot of people that had questions about that because they looked at the tape and they didn't believe that he was quick enough to do what he was doing at Michigan State. But if you look at the combine numbers and you look at his agility scores and his broad, and his jumps and all of the different types of explosive measurements that the combine did, and you compare it historically to other players, he compared to players who were praised for their agility and for their short area quickness. And they were players much lighter and much smaller than Le'Veon Bell at that time. Players like Javid Best of the Detroit Lions, and Ahmad Bradshaw, the longtime running back for the Giants and eventually the playing with the Colts. And when you look at Le'Veon Bell, 230 pounds, and you say that back is as quick or quicker than Ahmad Bradshaw, that should, when you look at the numbers like that, that should confirm to you that what you saw on film was correct. If it didn't show up on film that way, then what you want to ask are things about you need to find out whether he was hurt. You need to find out whether or not the offense, whether you're watching the film well enough to discern that the offense may have not been giving him opportunities to use that quickness. Or maybe he has certain difficulties really processing the game in a manner where his athletic ability comes to the fore because he's thinking too much and reacting too slowly mentally, because that's why players who often don't have great times but perform very well tend to be as good as they are, is that it's in the mind, being able to react as quickly as you can. An example of a player that I'll add, the last one, is Keith Marshall, the running back for the University of Georgia, who ran a 4.29 40-yard dash and a 4.31 40-yard dash. And a lot of people had written off Keith Marshall because they felt like he had endured an anterior cruciate ligament injury to his knee a couple years ago, and he got taken, the backfield duties were taken over by a running back by the name of Nick Chubb, who was a very good running back and a Heisman Trophy candidate until he got hurt this year. And Marshall split time and really was the backup to another younger back who was very talented and considered probably the best football player on the University of Georgia football team. All of that said, when you watch Keith Marshall on tape, you can see a back who is very mature, who understands how to run the ball in a way where he makes good decisions, where he understands how to set up his blockers, how he knows when to take certain gains or make certain choices, even though he knows that they may be not have the best high-end potential for yards, but it's going to have the best risk reward for his team. And you could see that he came very close to breaking big runs this year, but never did. So you never got a chance to see that 4.29 second speed. But if you watched him, you would see that he was often one tackle away from that happening, and that he was fast enough to get to the spot where it was very close. And those are the types of things that over time and experience, and if you're looking at what you should be looking at, you start to discern some of the subtleties of the game and the athletic ability of a player. And the 40 time for a guy like Marshall should make people who wrote him off go back and look to see those types of things that I was mentioning about his tape just now.
Yeah. Okay. But you already kind of dipped into it, so let's talk about this draft's running back class. How does this class compare to like last year, where we had Todd Gurley at the top and Melvin Gordon also in the first round?
Sure. I think that the running back class is still probably has some talents that are on par with last year's class. I thought last year's class was a special group of players who didn't get a chance to really show how good they could be year one. And a lot of that had to do with injuries and injuries to their teammates along the offensive line, because of offensive line play is critical to the success of a running back at the next level. Unless you are an elite special back who can make even a bad offensive line look good, a player like Adrian Peterson, Marshawn Lynch, and then to an extent, I think Todd Gurley did that at times last year. Your most running backs are going to need some help, and a guy like Melvin Gordon was a good prospect as a back, but his line was decimated very early on, and you could see that that didn't work out very well. So I think this class has some good players. It probably has, I think, somewhere between 3 to 4 players who would have been as good or better than many of the backs below Todd Gurley in this class, and then you have probably another 5 to 7 runners in this class who could emerge and develop into regular contributors for their team and maybe even become a starter.
Right. Okay. But let's talk about the top running back first, because most people agree that Zeke Elliott is the premier prospect at the position. But is he as good as Todd Gurley was as a prospect last year?
He's a different player, and I think that's the hard thing for people to understand sometimes, is comparing one to one. But you would say Ezekiel Elliott is probably not quite as good as Todd Gurley, in the sense that Todd Gurley has more long speed. He is a probably a better tackle breaker, where Todd Gurley can break multiple tackles in situations where a lot of running backs cannot do that. So Ezekiel Elliott is a guy that comes close to being able to do some of the same things that Todd Gurley can do as a power back, as a guy who can, get yards after contact, but he's not as dynamic of a tackle breaker. And while he has very good speed, he doesn't have great speed. And Todd Gurley has great speed for his size.
Right.
He is, though, a very good all-around back, and he's not very far away he wouldn't have been very far away from Todd Gurley in this class if I were rating them within the same group. He's I don't know if I'd say he's clearly the top guy in this class, but he certainly is one of the best, and he is probably the most likely to have the most productive beginning to his career, because he'll be on a team that will use him a lot, and he can be used in almost every situation.
Right. So how to move on to some of the other prospects? How much does workload actually mean for prospect? Because we've seen like Derrick Henry, he has a lot of carries during his college career, and some are worried that he might not have much tread left on the tire.
Sure.
So how do you see that aspect of it? How much do you actually use that in your evaluation of a player?
I would say it's almost on the level of being a myth that's unfounded. And the reason that I would say that is, you can look at players who are big, strong, and fast, who are punishing runners, and who had lots of carries during their career. And examples of that in the past were Cedric Benson of Texas, who played a pretty lengthy career with the Bears and the Bengals, and had some pretty nice years with the Bengals. You could also say Ricky Williams, the running back for who was drafted by the Saints and played with the Dolphins and with the Ravens and the Canadian Football League. In between, his year that he took off, he was a very punishing runner who had a lot of carries and played for a very long time. Ray Rice, who was a very small runner by comparison to these other two that I just mentioned, also had a very hard workload and a very high, a very heavy workload. So did Adrian Peterson. All of these backs have been very good runners in the NFL and have not broken down in the way that people expect them to. The bigger issue that you have to be concerned about is whether these players have lingering injuries that they play through. And that tends to be a little bit more of a secretive process at the combine, where they check out injuries, while the NFL, though, is notorious for leaking a lot of that information to the media. That's really, if you see a player drop inexplicably, oftentimes that's linked to the fact that there's an injury that is very risky in terms of a team wanting to invest in them.
Yeah, so you wouldn't, you look at this myth and you don't really account for it at all in your evaluation because you don't believe in the effect of it.
No, in fact, I would counter it, and it may be a myth in itself, but I would counter it in saying that when you are an aggressive player and you attack first and you are the one dishing out the contact, you tend to take less wear and tear and punishment than you do if you're receiving contact and not ready for it. So to me, it's a high injury rate position as it is, but it has more to do with the nature of the contact as opposed to how many times they do get contacted like that.
Okay, so that bodes well for Derrick Henry in that respect, in your book at least.
Yes.
So other than Zeke and Derrick, who in this class could actually be in the feature role, feature back role where they are a 3-down back?
A lot of backs. And that's what's interesting, because the running back position is probably the most talent rich, and it's probably talent saturated of any position in the league, because nowadays the running game isn't emphasized nearly as much as the passing game was many years ago, but you still have some of your best players, football players and athletes, playing this position. So guys who fit that bill, I had talked about Keith Marshall earlier. Keith Marshall was, I work at the University of Georgia, and I've been there for a number of years, and I can tell you that Keith Marshall was at one time considered the better back between Todd Gurley and himself. And he's the much faster. He was the much faster player. He was a rugged guy. He was an all-around good football player who's a very good receiver out of the backfield. Marshall can be that player if he's fully recovered from his injury, and it looks like, you look at his times, and from what I saw on the field, he is. And I've seen players like Frank Gore, Jamal Lewis, Willis McGahee as examples of players who didn't look quite healthy in the early year and a half after their injury, and then came back and had better NFL careers than they did college careers. And actually Marshall may very well be that next in line. Another player who's a good example of, Peyton Barber is an unknown player out of Auburn who made some waves this week because he actually lives probably he grew up probably not more than 20 miles from where I live right now. And his mother is actually is disabled, I believe, and has not been able to have a home for herself. She's been living with family, and it's been very tight living quarters in poverty. And he left school early because he wanted to be able to make a living and give his mother, and his family, easier living situation than what they have. But he didn't start more than 1 year at Auburn, but he is a very punishing runner. who knows very well how to change direction and set up blocking schemes. He's a good receiver, and he has a lot of promise as a pass protector. He's not extraordinarily fast, but like Arian Foster, he's very much like Arian Foster is a good example of a player that I would probably compare him to in terms of physical abilities and potential, but he's probably not, he's not as talented as what Foster was early on in Foster's career. Other players I'll mention briefly. Kenneth Dixon is a very good football player, very quick, can make a lot of people miss or create angles that are hard for defenders to get full contact on him. He can catch the ball well. He's a very smart, driven football player that I would not be surprised develops into a starter. Alex Collins from Arkansas has good footwork. He is a powerful runner in his own right. He's not extremely fast, but he's smart about how to run the football, and he's fast enough. Paul Perkins is fast. He can catch the ball in the backfield. He has that change of direction that's very exciting. And I think that, he compares favorably, or I would say actually he compares along the spectrum of a player like Devonta Freeman, the Falcons running back, who had a very nice year to begin last year. And then I'll add a couple more players to keep an eye on. One would be Jordan Howard of Indiana, who's a classic power back. Trey Carson is also the same type of player in that mold. And then Kelvin Taylor and DeAndre Washington. Kelvin Taylor is former running back star for the Jaguars, Fred Taylor's son. And if he can become a little more disciplined of a football player on the field, he has the physical skills to be a good one. And DeAndre Washington of Texas Tech is a very quick player, plays under a lot of control, and he can make a lot of people miss, but he's stronger than you think. He's kind of got that very thick lower body that's very good for explosion and for being able to break tackles.
Right. But how important are feature backs really? Now we just got some feature back names on the table. But
sure.
How important are they in today's NFL, where a lot of teams they actually play out from the shotgun, and we don't really see these feature backs many places. So how important is it that they can play all three downs now?
Well, I think the thing is it's more about finding someone who is such a good match and can stay healthy and can deliver that kind of skill. And that's a little bit harder sometimes to do. So, but the way I would turn that question around is if you look at who has been a Super Bowl caliber team or has been to the Super Bowl, you would look at teams like Seattle that had a feature back in Marshawn Lynch. You would look at the Ravens, who had Ray Rice. You would look at the 49ers, who had Frank Gore. And this is all in the past 3 to 4 years. Certainly there are teams like New England that operate a short passing game that substitutes the short, runs with short passes. You would look at the Broncos. The Broncos, if it weren't for the fact that CJ Anderson started playing better and they had to go more towards a run attack, they probably wouldn't have gotten to the Super Bowl with just the arm of Peyton Manning. So, and CJ Anderson was hurt all year, which caused a lot of the turmoil that they had because they were really leaning on him to be their featured player. I would argue that in most cases, teams would prefer to be able to have a top-notch feature back, but it's a little bit more difficult to do because it includes being able to block, to pass protect, to be able to catch a ball in the backfield, and just also being able to stay healthy. So to me, it's like this. It seems to me there's a very good track record of saying that a feature back makes your offense more diverse and harder to key on scheme wise because they're not looking at substitutions and saying, we know what they're going to do based on who they bring into the game. But it also is, the best teams. There's a reason why the best teams have some of these best feature backs because they're not, not everyone can get them. So it's that's kind of how I put it. So I mentioned a lot of guys, but a lot of those guys, it's from there's potential for them to develop into that. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will.
Right. Okay. So for you to let's move on to some of these more NFL 2016 backs, if we could say it like that. The more natural passing down back, at least. Where we see the running back who could be both a good pass blocker in a shotgun scheme, but also a receiver out of the backfield. Who do you see as the most natural in that aspect?
Well, Keith Marshall is actually one of the best receivers of this class, so you can add Keith Marshall to that group. If you go to a site called Draft Breakdown, run by Brian Perez, there's tape on Keith Marshall, I believe, in the Nebraska game. If it's not there, then you can find it on YouTube, and you'll see Keith Marshall as a receiver. He's a very natural receiver out of the backfield. I would add that Kenneth Dixon is a good receiver out of the backfield. We talked about, Ezekiel Elliott's an all-around back. Peyton Barber can catch. Paul Perkins is a good receiver. Some other players that catch the ball well are Brandon Wilds, the running back out of South Carolina, who is an underrated player who's also got good size. Devontae Booker is a pretty good pass catching player out of Utah. CJ Precise is a player who's a former wide receiver for Notre Dame, is transitioning to running back, and he and Tyler Irvin are also very quick, good pass catchers who can run the ball well enough that you could consider them for roles that are more than just a very isolated third down situation.
Right, and I actually use Draft Breakdown quite a bit. Just here yesterday, I saw CJ Precise, like 2 games of him, and I've come off pretty impressed. But that's if you're looking at this crop of running backs, who are the ones not getting enough buzz, if you will?
Sure.
Who's not getting enough attention?
Sure. Well, I mean, I mentioned Barber and Marshall. I think they're very much in that sense that they're going to be probably the popular dark horse players from here on out, because they've had good combines, and Marshall made such a splash. People are going to come out of the woodwork talking about him very soon. Guys who are probably not getting enough credit, I think Trey Carson of Texas A&M is a powerful runner who didn't play on a team that was particularly good at times, and I think that he's underrated. I'm going to give you some guys that no one is really talking about. Okay.
Right.
Okay. So there's a guy by the name of Jalen Richard, who is from Southern Mississippi, and he is 5'8", 210 pounds. He was a track athlete, so he's pretty fast, but he's a kind of low to the ground running back who plays with good power. And I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't get drafted, but he winds up doing well in a camp in the way that C.J. Anderson did. And maybe not as good as that, but someone who might make a team based on what he can do as a kick returner and a running back.
Yeah.
Another player is Dwayne Washington. He is from the University of Washington. He's a former wide receiver. He's 6'2", 226 pounds, and he is very fast. Maybe not Keith Marshall fast, but very few people are 219 pounds and as fast as Keith Marshall is. But Washington has that kind of breakaway speed. He can catch the football well, and he's a powerful runner. He didn't start this past year at the University of Washington, but he's had some very good games, and he's an interesting player who could develop into an even better one down the line. And then I would say, probably just a solid player, or another guy that a lot of people don't know about, is Chase Price out of San Diego State, who is 5'8", 200, and he's not a very fast player, but he's very smart about how he runs the football, and he runs with good power for his size. He's a player that I'm going to be watching a little bit more over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, but some of these players you just mentioned, they're not even invited to the combine. I just looked it up. So how they don't have this window to give themselves exposure. Do this exposure, what can it do for a player's draft stock? To like blow the roof off of the combine, how much can it do for their draft stock?
Well, that's the interesting thing is I don't know how the dynamics of what businesses are like in Denmark, but I can tell you that in the United States that um, it's almost farcical sometimes with how people can take information and blow it out of proportion in a manner that they end up making decisions that are ill-advised because of the fact that they don't use the information the right way. One of the most important things about using information is filtering it critically. And I think that the NFL oftentimes ends up overemphasizing certain skills. And it's not always the scouts who overemphasize it. It's not always the general manager of an organization that overemphasizes, though they tend to be more prone to do that. It can be ownership. An owner may be someone who maybe he went to school in Texas and he runs a team in Tennessee, and he left Tennessee, he left Texas, he moved the team from Texas to Tennessee because he had some disagreements with the local business culture there, and moved his team, and now he wants to get, at all cost, he wants to get the star from Texas, from the University of Texas, to play for his team. And he's so hell bent on doing that he would override the months of work that his employees will have done. And some of that they will use as reasoning as well. Look what he did at the combine. Look at the number he put up here.
Yeah.
I have talked with scouts who, after a workout that had nothing to do with really playing football, but just throwing the football, not really. Alex Smith is a good example. Alex Smith had a fourth round grade by the St. Louis Rams one year, but due to his workout being impressive, the general manager went to the scouts and said, "Here's a tape of 20 throws. I want you to redo your grades of film study just based on these 20 throws." And not the 7 or 8 or 12 games that they watched, 20 throws. And of course, all 20 throws were completions. And the scout who told this story, you can read it in Sports Illustrated online, as told to Michael Silver, he had to be separated from the general manager during an argument that ensued over the fact that the general manager wanted to do this. So these types of things can happen and be blown out of proportion because, again, it's not so much how fast you are, how far you can jump, how explosive you are. Those things are important, but you also have to know the skills of the game and understand how the game works so that you can use these skills in a very quick, reactive, intelligent fashion. And that requires a lot of practice. And so it's one of those things that when teams often say, well, we'll coach this player and we'll make him better. But the players that I know who have played in the league will tell you to a man that most teams do not spend a lot of time coaching the techniques of a football player. They actually spend more time coaching just the game plan strategy. So most players who are young, who become good, learn by learning from veterans or getting consultants or developing things on their own to get better at those actual skills that make them so great rather than just good athletes. And I'll give you an example that I'm not going to give the name because I just don't think it would be right just at this stage. But I had the family of one of the running backs you just mentioned to me in this conversation call me after seeing one of my videos and asked me for consulting help in terms of not me consulting with them, but finding someone who could consult with them to help them develop their game a little bit more, because they also are clearly becoming aware that that's not how this is going to work. That they're going to get into coaching and get coached up, even though they may have had a good combine. So, I put them in touch with someone who actually does that type of thing. So it's the combine is important, and it gives you layers to confirm what you see on tape, or to go back and figure out whether or not it actually showed up there, and why it did or didn't, or how it can.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very interesting story, by the way. But if we okay, so let's go. I have one question off topic here, which is which running back could blow this combine out of proportion, but also out of proportion in relation to his own skill set. If you know what I mean, who could actually
Yeah.
blow the combine off and not really have the skill set to back it up.
Yeah, I would say there's a player that a lot of people are getting excited about from Cal by the name of Daniel Lasco, who had an impressive performance physically, and I think he's a pretty good runner. But I'm not completely, I'm not completely sold that he has the ability to convert his physical skills to the playing field in the manner that in the manner that he showed on tape. What he showed on tape is as I would say, is an average college running back, maybe and I think that he would be a below, if if he doesn't learn to do some things differently, I think he is probably a below average running back in many respects. Another thing that I would probably say is that Kenyon Drake from Alabama is a very fast, explosive athlete, but he doesn't really understand how to run between the tackles. He doesn't really understand how to use his footwork to set up running lanes and to make people miss in a way that's going to help him be more efficient with what he does. So, those are two players that probably will have good performances, already have had good performances, that I think still have some learning to do, and I'm not convinced that they're going to be able to make that transition quick enough to really capture the attention of an NFL team.
Right. Okay, so switching gears a bit to go away from the running backs in this class, because I saw your RSP film room about Vernon Adams Jr., and you seemed higher on him than many of the other analysts that I follow. So what makes you higher on him than the quote unquote consensus? What kind of player is Vernon Adams?
Sure. I'm higher on Vernon Adams than the consensus, most likely because of two reasons. One is that Vernon Adams is shorter than what most people say is the baseline for quarterback play. There are a lot of people that still impose a height weight barrier to what they consider a worthwhile quarterback prospect. I don't do that. I was one of the very few people early on who embraced Russell Wilson's skills as a potential starter who could be on the level of Drew Brees. And I also was someone, even though I wasn't doing the RSP back then, when I was writing about football, who also commented on Drew Brees himself being potentially a very good NFL starter for a long period of time, if he landed in the right situation and got the development that he needed, and he did. So I've never been one to look at height and weight with the level of prejudice that a lot of teams and a lot of analysts do. What makes Vernon Adams a good player is that he understands the football game in terms of how to manage football as a quarterback, and that requires a couple of things. You have to be very competent of how to execute the structure of a football play, but you also have to be equally as competent at being able to improvise when that structure gets taken away from you. And he's good at both. He's also has an aggressive mindset to the game, and that's something that pro quarterbacks have to have. They have to be willing to throw the ball into tight areas where the receiver is the only one that has a chance to catch the ball, but it's a more of a throw of difficulty because there's a defender very close in the area. You have to be able to be willing to spot up when you spot opportunities for single coverage against a receiver to be able to go downfield and attack. And he can do that. And he can integrate all of these things together in addition to his athletic ability to escape the pocket, to maintain a good throwing position on the move, and to be able to throw the ball at a great distance with good velocity and accuracy down the field to be able to merit that aggressive tendency. And he can do this from a variety of, I would say, positions that are off the typical platform of how technique is taught. It's kind of like in basketball that you would watch a basketball guard be able to make passes from strange angles or unconventional angles and find his teammates so that they have easy open opportunities to make baskets. And Vernon Adams does that very well. I think that his pocket maneuverability is somewhat underrated, and and to be able to handle, to be the size that he is, he's going to have to be mobile, but he's also going to have to be maneuverable. And I define that differently, because maneuverability is being able to move around within a set structure of what I would call is a pocket in the NFL, of this small space, and not over exaggerate the movements, but to be able to move subtly so that you can create an open space to make a throw, or to be able to find an open player, or to be able to to be able to avoid the angles of a defender without disrupting your throwing process, or your process of just reading and throwing. And I think that Vernon Adams does all of these things very well. And you have to consider the fact that he played at Eastern Washington last year, which was a much lower division of football than Oregon. And he made the move to Oregon this year and played as well as he did. And he did it over the summer. That's a transition that a lot of quarterbacks would never dare make. And he did it very well.
Yeah. But a lot of evaluators, they compare him to Johnny Manziel in his playing style, and he needs chaos to thrive, and all that. All those sentences are thrown around. Is that justified?
No.
No.
And I will. Johnny Manziel, unfortunately, what sometimes happens is that there can be people can conflate what happened with Johnny Manziel's behavior off the field with what he is on the field, and then use those things against another player. And what I would say is that's probably lackadaisical analysis, or analysis that hasn't gone deep enough and understands really what goes on with Johnny Manziel. Because Johnny Manziel was actually a very good quarterback prospect on the field. The problem is that he has either an alcohol problem or some sort of substance abuse problem, and he has maturity issues. And that's very important, of course, if you're going to be a figurehead leader of a team and a professional. You need to be able to function on a reliable basis and a mature basis, especially if you're going to lead people. And he wasn't capable of that on a consistent level. But if you watched his games last year, you would actually see that, especially against Pittsburgh, was a good example of a defense that often would force a player to move around with the way that they attack. He was very good from the pocket. He was very good at being able to do things in a controlled fashion. And part of his game, though, and which is true, part of the truth of what these analysts are stating is that he's good at being able to do things off structure and with chaos. And sometimes he's done some things that are very over the top and probably too wild and too immature, but got away with it when he was at Texas A&M. And you can usually get away with things like that in college football. And then when the gap in competition narrows significantly, then in the NFL, you have to learn to kind of explore your boundaries enough to kind of learn where you can't get away with the same things you used to. And I think he was making his way towards doing that, but at the same time, he was never shoring up what his real problems were, which was off the field.
Right.
So yes, Vernon Adams can do some of those same things as Johnny Manziel, but a good game I would recommend people to watch is the Washington game.
Yeah.
Again, and where he shows very good maneuverability and skill to climb the pocket, and skill to be able to play within a controlled nature where, even though maybe things got off structure, he wasn't trying to just run around and tire people out and just throw the ball wildly. He was being able to make very minor adjustments of a high level of difficulty and find the open player as a result of doing so.
Right. Another game that Johnny Manziel played well in was the first half against the Bengals. But to stay on track here with Vernon Adams, who does he remind you of in the NFL? Because some compare him to the other quote unquote short quarterbacks in the NFL, Manziel and Russell Wilson. That's really two polarities. It's very hard to compare him. But is it fair to compare him to how Russell Wilson won in Wisconsin? Or should we compare him with a whole other quarterback?
I would probably compare him to how Russell Wilson won in the team before he went to Wisconsin, which was North Carolina State, where he was more of a scrambler. Right. At Wisconsin, he was much more of a controlled play action pocket passer because they had the offensive line to support him in that type of fashion. I think that comparisons are best made not so much as to how talented they are, though you can have some of that in the mix, but I tend to try to do player comparisons on a spectrum of players, based on the skills, not based on the skill level, but the types of skills and how they express those skills.
Where he wins.
Where he wins, like as Josh Norris would say,
exactly. Yeah.
Where he wins, what he, where his influences are. I mean, you look at it and would say that because of the fact that he's mobile, because of the fact that he can play within control with that mobility, the fact that he has a strong arm and he's accurate down the field, and that he seems to have a good balance with knowing when to run and when to maintain his platform as a passer, that there's a lot of similarities in style to Russell Wilson. The question is whether he can make that transition to the speed of the game as well and become as good as Russell Wilson is. And I would say the answer to that, as much as I like Vernon Adams, is he'll have to prove that. Yeah. And right now I would say he's probably among the top 5 to 7 quarterbacks in this class for me. But he is, but that means that he's a mid-round talent in my eyes, and most likely that means in the NFL's eyes he will probably be an undrafted player who will just try to break into the league as a free agent.
Undrafted.
Yeah.
But how big of a problem is it that Vernon Adams, even though there's room, he rarely steps up in the pocket close to his O-line, as I see it. I know he does it sometimes, but the norm is that he avoids it, it seems.
Well, I think that, yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the scheme, who you're seeing him play against. And it also depends on, you have to understand that what a player knows their strengths or weaknesses. You're not going to see Russell Wilson step up into the line unless there's a wide line split, or Drew Brees step up into the line and do that. You're not going to see Peyton Manning for several years actually take snaps from center until this recent year, and he didn't look all that good doing it, because there are certain strengths and weaknesses to every player's game. So Vernon Adams being shorter, yeah, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for him to climb up into a pocket and try and throw over a defender in the same way that a prospect like Connor Cook could at look at the Alabama game, where even though he didn't have a great statistical performance, he did a number of impressive things against Alabama's defense, where he was in a tight pocket and could make throws over that line and make very accurate plays. But at the same time, you're not going to ask if Connor Cook gets rushed and he's forced to escape the pocket, he's going to get sacked. So I would say the real issue is, what kind of fit are you looking for with that quarterback, and understanding that. And a lot of teams are still behind the times when it comes to, look, Vernon Adams can be a productive quarterback for us. If we trust the fact, if we believe that he can be accurate, if we believe that he can run the offense and that he's smart enough to be able to read the field and make the decisions that that you need him to make, we can use an offense that will open up passing lanes for him and give him a little bit more movement than other quarterbacks, where he's not always rolling to one side or the other. But Drew Brees is a great example. Drew Brees is a player that, if you watch his tape, he's always taking snaps where he rolls a little bit to one side or another, even if there's not set up movement embedded with him doing bootlegs or play action passes where he's literally rolling to one side. And a lot of that is based on the fact that they know that he's short, and that him climbing the pocket to try and throw isn't going to be as a successful endeavor as it would be if they set it up so that he has natural passing lanes that the line can commit through that early action of the drop.
Right. Okay, so now we just touched a bit on Vernon Adams, but let's talk about the top quarterbacks of the draft. The consensus, again, to use that word, says that it's Goff, Wentz, and Lynch at the top. Is that your top three as well, and in which order do you have them?
Well, I'm still compiling my publication. I still have a month before I actually put it out. Yeah. So
how many pages are you in?
I actually haven't written anything yet, but really, well, I mean, some of the structures are already set up because it's an annual publication, but most of, what I'm still doing is research. So,
right.
And I tend to wait till the end to research a lot of the quarterbacks. So I'm still watching third and fourth games of players as I'm compiling rankings. But I will say that so far, I would say Goff and Wentz certainly are near the top at this stage. And they're players that, I would agree that they're probably going to belong there. Lynch, to me, is very close in that range of being one of those players, but I like two or three players nearly as much, and I wouldn't be surprised if there may be a couple more who might be within that argument too. I think this is a very intriguing quarterback class because you have the top three. You may have the top two, top three players, and then you have maybe about 7 or 8 players who, if they land in the right situation, one or two of them will land in a good enough situation that they will probably develop into a competent starter that maybe fans will say, oh, we need a better quarterback if we're going to get to the Super Bowl, but he'll get them to the playoffs on a regular basis, or he'll get them in position and he'll just need a little bit more help than somebody else, So a player who would be one that may be surprised to some people is that Cardale Jones, to me, right now is, to me, grades out slightly better than Paxton Lynch, despite the fact that major media may say that he had horrible performances this year, and his tape looked really bad. But in my estimation, they also took the offense that he was excellent in and played top tier talent in top games the previous year, and they junked it. I mean, It's kind of like, if you're a great baker, and you won a series of competitions in Denmark for your baking,
yeah,
and then the person who co-owns the restaurant with you decided that they were going to make it a steakhouse, and they asked you to become a butcher. That's basically what happened to Cardale Jones with this offense. Maybe not as dramatic, but that's my analogy.
Yeah, okay. That's a good analogy, and you should stick to it. But is there one of the three quarterbacks that you think, we have Cleveland at the top and Cowboys also maybe looking for the future answer at quarterback? Do you think that there's a quarterback in this draft that would be worth drafting with the first 5 picks?
Um,
I know you're not done with your.
yeah, you might know my deal, but I will say this: I will say that to go from if I were to look at it from a conventional point of view, and not the point of view that I normally have, the answer is yes, because teams always feel like that if you think that quarterback can develop into being a franchise caliber player, then you have to pick him because it's rare to get that opportunity to have one. And that teams will also rationalize it by saying we didn't think players like Aaron Rodgers or Drew Brees or Brett Favre were worthy enough to be first round picks. And they somehow turned into great quarterbacks. So why not, maybe if we think these guys need a little bit of development, but they have that kind of potential, we should do so. We should pick them. So I think Goff probably from a traditional standpoint is going to be a better fit in Dallas, where he will have a run game that will work better with him and that he doesn't have to deal with the elements and as you would see in Cleveland, so that maybe the hand size of being 9 inches of gripping the football might not be as big of an issue. I'm a little dubious about that particular measurement because, on the one hand, the college football is actually a little wider to grip than the NFL ball. The NFL ball is longer. So the fact that there's much ado made out of this, I find a little humorous. But the argument against it as an anecdotal argument is that Ryan Tannehill has 9-inch hands. People were worried about his hand size. He plays in Miami, which tends to be fine. But where he's had some issues with turnovers tend to be against teams like New England in New England when the weather is not as good. But then my other argument would be, well, you also are playing one of the best teams in football right now. If New England wasn't all that good, maybe this wouldn't be such an issue. And it's somewhat anecdotal, but I would say Wentz is going to fit that anecdotal of big, strong, played in a cold weather state, and will be used to that cold weather in Cleveland and would fit very well there. So I think that those are probably where I think most people are thinking they will go, and I can understand the logic behind it.
Okay, and that should actually just about do it for us. So I think I will thank you so much for joining me here on our Huddle Up podcast here. And I think you should follow Matt Waldman at Matt Waldman. All this promotional stuff we have to get to, right?
Oh, well, I appreciate that. I do very much. And it's nice to know, it's nice to actually to be able to do a podcast in Denmark for a Denmark audience, a Danish audience. It would be, I have to say, I mean, I have never been to Europe, and I hope I get a chance. And one of the first places I'd like to go, and I'm not just saying this because, one of the first places I've always wanted to go is Denmark. So, so it's nice to have, it's nice to have readers who actually are from here and let me know, have shared that with me over the years, and it's nice to be on. So
thank you for coming on, and I hope to do it with you another time. And thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.